and W, special. This brings up the point that some of the caliber designations that we have been discussing above refer to the cartridge only, and others refer to the gun only, and some to both. Examples of names referring to guns only are the .45 caliber Thompson submachine gun, the .30 caliber Browning automatic rifle, the .30 caliber Springfield. Examples of names referring to cartridges only are the .45-70-500 cartridge, the .38 special mid-range, the .22 high-speed, the .30 caliber 06, etc. Examples of names which may apply equally well to either the cartridge or the gun that shoots it are .22 long rifle, .45 Colt, and .45 automatic Colt pistol. Star gauges the bore of the gun, which gives it its caliber name as described above, is reamed to a very exact dimension, and in order to check this diameter, the manufacturer makes use of an instrument called a star gauge. This JS a rod carrying on one end a set of guides to fit the rifling, so that the rod will follow the twist of the lands and grooves when it is pushed through the bore. The rod also carries a pair of points on opposite sides, so arranged that when a wedge inside the hollow rod is pushed in, the points will move outward. The outward motion of these points is read on a micrometer or vernier scale in 0.010 of an inch, so that by pushing this rod through the bore, and stopping at intervals and pushing the points outward until they touch the opposite walls of the bore, the diameter of the bore at the points in question may be read. 2 sets of points are furnished, one to use when measuring the lands, and another to use in the grooves. A star-gauged rifle is merely one which has been measured in this way to see whether or not its bore is accurately manufactured. Star gauges must be made carefully for the exact caliber of the gun in which they are to be used, and with separate heads for each type of rifling. They are very expensive, and as a rule are found only in the large arms factories. Smoothbore shotguns, as was intimated previously, all small arms may be divided into 2 general classes, namely smoothbored guns and rifled arms. The only smoothbore that is much used at present is the shotgun, which is intended to fire a charge of small shot, and is used principally for bird shooting. A charge of shot may consist of any number of balls from 9, used in the 00 buckshot loads, to several hundred in the loads of fine birdshot. When the shotgun is fired, the charge leaves the barrel in a compact mass of separate pellets of shot, traveling together, but the mass immediately separates into a small cloud of individual projectiles, traveling in the same general direction, and at the same approximate speed. As the charge gets further away from the gun, the diameter of the pattern increases, so that in shooting at a bird, a hit is likely to be scored by one or more of the pellets on the edge of the pattern, even if the aim is not exact. For shooting at land birds, where the range is likely to be short, guns are used which have the barrel bored to the same diameter at the muzzle as at the breech. These are called cylinder bores. These make the shot spread out quickly, which is desirable in shooting at close quick-flying birds, such as the partridge, which may very well be missed entirely if the shot is in a compact mass, or if hit by such a mass of shot would be unduly torn and mangled. For long-range work, such as duck and goose shooting, it is necessary to have the pattern hold together, so that when it reaches a distance of perhaps 50 yards, where the game may be, it will not be in such a thin pattern as to be ineffective. This is accomplished by making the barrel of the gun smaller at the muzzle, so that the charge of shot is squeezed together before it leaves the muzzle. Such guns are said to be choke-bored. While shotguns are primarily intended for the use of small shot, they can be used to fire a single large ball, and round ball loads are available commercially. However, the accuracy is very poor, for these balls have to be made with due regard for the fact that they may be used in any kind of gun by the uninstructed purchaser, and for that reason the ball is always made small enough so that it can be used in a choke-bored gun. This means that, for example, the ball loaded into a 12-gauge shotgun shell cannot be the full 12-gauge diameter, for the choked bore is smaller than this. On this account, the ball loaded into the 12-gauge shell would really be a much smaller size. In addition to the round ball, there are available several types of patented conical bullet for the shotgun. These bullets have spiral ribs on the outside, or there is some other device for the purpose of obtaining some of the ballistic advantages of the rifled arm. With either the round ball or the conical bullet, the shotgun makes a deadly weapon at any range where a hit can be secured, but the effective range is usually limited by the poor accuracy obtainable. Another odd foreign arm which is seldom seen in America is the paradox gun, which is really a shotgun having the last few inches of the muzzle rifled, so that it will impart a spin to the patented slug that is used with it when it is desired to fire a large single projectile instead of a charge of shot. This gun is not very likely to be encountered in this country, but should be looked for in case the investigator finds a large shotgun projectile showing the marks of rifling. A somewhat similar effect is sometimes secured by cutting through the paper of the shell between the wads separating the powder and the shot, so that the part containing the shot is almost entirely cut off from the part containing the powder. When the shell is fired, the forward part goes out of the gun in one compact mass. This procedure is not to be recommended as it has a tendency to raise the pressure of the powder, for the barrel of a shotgun is smaller than the chamber that fits the cartridge, and therefore the cartridge, or shell as it is often called, is larger than the inside diameter of the barrel. When the partly cut shell is fired, the forward part, carrying the shot load, is forced through the slope, or lead, connecting the chamber with the barrel, and as this forward part of the shell is larger in diameter than the barrel, a squeeze occurs at this point which may raise the pressure dangerously. Another squeeze occurs when this section of the shell passes the choke at the muzzle. Besides the birdshot loads and the round ball loads, shotguns can be used with buckshot cartridges. These cartridges are regularly furnished for riot work, prison guards, etc., and the Army also uses these riot loads. The most common riot load consists of 9 pellets of 00 buckshot, which are 0.32 inch in diameter. Another common load is 12 pellets of 0 buck 0.30 inch in diameter. Such loads are generally fired in riot guns, which are shot tins with short barrels, cylinder bored. The riot gun is generally made in the pump-action repeater type. With the plain birdshot load, the shotgun produces terrible wounds when fired at close range, for the shot sticks together in a fairly compact mass and simply blows a rat hole through the victim. Within a few inches of the muzzle of the gun, the entrance wound is less than an inch in diameter, but as the distance increases, the size of the hole becomes larger owing to the spread of the shot. Within a yard or so, it is impossible to tell by looking at the hole whether the charge was fired by a choke bored gun or by a cylinder gun. As the range increases, the pattern becomes larger until at 40 yards with a choke bored gun, only about 70% of the pellets will be found in a 30-inch circle. Pistol cartridge adapters for rifles. It is well for the firearms identification man to remember the fact that there are several makes of auxiliary chamber or adapter that can be used in rifles to enable pistol or revolver cartridges to be fired in the rifle. A well-known adapter of this type is the one made by the Marble Arms and Manufacturing Company, and called by them auxiliary cartridges. With these auxiliary cartridges, the following pistol cartridges can be fired in rifles as listed. .22 caliber long rifle cartridge can be used in .22 high-power rifle. .25 short Stevens rimfire .25-35 rifle. .25 automatic pistol cartridge in .25 Remington rifle. .290-3000 Savage rifle 6.5 mm. Mannlicher Schooner 30-30 rifle. .32 short Colt cartridge in .30 Remington rifle. .30-40 Krag 32 Smith & Wesson cartridge in 3.4 Ace Meat. .303 British 30-40 Krag. .30 U.S. Government. .32 Colt automatic cartridge in 4 AE Ito. .303 British. .32 Winchester Special SS J. .35 Remington 38 automatic pistol cartridge in 35 Winchester. .35 Smith & Wesson automatic in 8 mm rifles. The Winchester Repeating Arms Company manufactures a supplemental chamber enabling the .32 Smith & Wesson cartridge to be used in .30 caliber and .303 rifles. The adapters described above are used in rifles, but there is a similar device for use in shotguns called the rifled bullet shell, which renders it possible to shoot certain pistol cartridges in shotguns. These come in the more popular gauges and are more or less used in England, but in this country they are seldom seen. In fact, the author cannot recall ever having seen one in the hands of a shooter. The Peterson device. During the World War, the U.S. government adopted and kept highly secret an automatic bolt for the Springfield rifle, called the Peterson device. The official name given to this device by the Ordnance Department was the .30 caliber automatic pistol, model of 1918. The device carries on its front end a supplemental chamber to fit into the chamber of the Springfield rifle, and fires a special .30 caliber high-velocity rimless pistol-type cartridge. In use, the ordinary bolt of the rifle is removed, and this automatic bolt is inserted in its place. Then a magazine containing 40 rounds of the pistol ammunition is attached to the side of the device, and the first loading motion is made by hand, after which one shot will be fired for each pull of the trigger, as long as the ammunition holds out. When the magazine is exhausted, a new one can be attached in a fraction of a second. The rifle with which the device is to be used is the ordinary Springfield rifle with a special ejection port cut into the left side of the receiver and an extra lever added on to the sear. These changes in no way interfered with the use of the regular rifle ammunition in the gun, which, modified in this manner, was called the .30 caliber Springfield rifle Mark I. The auxiliary chamber used in this device was finely rifled with 10 lands and grooves. A bullet fired in this first received the rifling marks from the device itself, then received rifling marks from the rifle barrel through which it subsequently passed. As this device was most successfully kept secret during the war and for many years afterward, any bullet fired from it would have presented a puzzling appearance to the firearms expert. During the war, about 63,000 of these devices together with 69 million rounds of ammunition for them were manufactured. All this material was kept in army stores for a good many years after the war, but finally the ammunition deteriorated and the devices themselves became obsolete and they were converted into scrap iron. Of course, these devices could have been sold, but it was the policy of the government not to allow them to fall into the hands of the public where they might be put to improper purposes, so they were all destroyed and not even a sample can be obtained at this time. However, the device is mentioned here because it is quite possible that some of the bullets fired from this device long ago might be submitted to the expert with the question as to what it could be. And moreover, there is always a chance that some of these devices may have escaped destruction and may still be in existence. Air guns. In detective fiction, the reader will sometimes be regaled with stories of the cunning criminal who uses an air gun of high power and mysterious design to kill his victims quickly and noiselessly. While no such weapon exists, there really are air rifles which are sufficiently dangerous to be serious candidates for the attention of the firearms expert, especially in civil suits for damages involving loss of eyesight or some other injury. There really have been very large air guns which were intended for use in actual warfare. Such were the 3 cannon used in the 90s on the U.S. dynamite cruiser Vesuvius. This ship was intended to fire projectiles charged with dynamite, and as the shock of firing such shell from a cannon would cause a premature explosion of the bursting charge, 3 very large air guns were constructed and installed in the forward part of the ship. They were built into the structure of the vessel and projected at a considerable angle of elevation from the forward deck. This ship was used, with small effect, in the bombardment of Morro Castle at Santiago de Cuba in 1898. The air pressure was sufficient to throw the projectiles a mile or more, but not with any great speed. They were not intended to penetrate, but rather to have a blasting effect by the explosion of a large quantity of high explosive against the surface. At the present time, there are a number of air rifles made to shoot a small spool-shaped pellet of .22 or of .177 caliber, with a velocity of about 435 fs, as described on page 12 of the textbook of pistols and revolvers. The .22 caliber pellet weighs 15 grains, and thus will give a muzzle energy of 6.3 foot-pounds, which is about 4% of that given by the least powerful common firearm, the .22 short rim fire rifle. These little bullets will penetrate about 1/2 inch in ordinary soft pine wood, and will readily kill birds and small animals. In one case known to the author, a pig was killed by a BSA air rifle. The bullet struck in the abdomen, and penetrated far enough inside to cause the animal to be found dead a day or 2 later. While ordinarily these guns would not be classed as deadly weapons, it is certain that if a person were shot in the abdomen with such a gun, death might follow if proper surgical attention were not promptly given, and it is self-evident that such guns are capable of destroying the eyesight. Owing to the very light weight of the bullets used, and their blunt shape, they lose velocity very rapidly, and would hardly do any appreciable damage at a range greater than 100 yards. Perhaps the best-known gun of this type is that made in England by the Birmingham Small Arms Company, which is called the BSA. There is one made in the United States which is called the Crossman. The BSA has 12 lands and grooves, left-handed twist, while the Crossman has 6 lands and grooves, right-hand twist. Another gun of this kind, which is quite powerful, is the Webley, and there are several different ones made in Germany and sold under different names. Earlier guns were muzzle loaders, which were loaded by first putting a charge of powder into the barrel, then putting in a bullet and forcing it down on top of the powder with a ramrod, and then priming the gun. In the earliest muzzle loaders, this priming was accomplished by putting a charge of very fine powder in a pan on the side of the breech, which communicated with the interior of the barrel by means of a small hole. When it was desired to fire the gun, the priming charge was ignited by means of a slow match, or in later years by the sparks from a piece of flint held in the cock, which corresponds to the hammer of a modern gun. A great improvement was the invention of the percussion cap. This is a small copper cup containing some material which will ignite when it is struck or crushed. In the later muzzle loaders, a hollow tube or nipple projects from the breech, and the hole in the nipple communicates with the charge inside. To fire the loaded gun, the hammer is cocked, a cap is placed on the nipple, and the trigger is pulled, which allows the hammer to fall and explode the cap. The fire from the cap flashes through the hole in the nipple and ignites the charge. When the cap explodes, it generally splits to pieces, and part of the flash surrounds the outside of the nipple, making a gray smudge on the nearby metal. In a day or two, this gray smudge becomes streaked with bright red rust. By looking at this point on a muzzle loader, it can be quickly told if the gun has recently been fired. Some muzzle loaders are still in use throughout the country. Perhaps the double-barreled shotgun is the type most often seen in use today. The muzzle-loading muskets or rifles were often supplied with cartridges, which consisted of a bullet having a paper packet attached to it containing the proper amount of powder to make up a charge. To load, the end of the paper was torn off and the powder poured down the barrel, then the bullet was rammed down on top of it. Cartridges for breech loaders. When the breech loader was in the process of invention and development, the greatest difficulty that was encountered was the tendency for the gas of the explosion, under its terrifically high pressure, to escape through the joints of the mechanism. The breech loader was never successful until a way was found to overcome this difficulty. The way finally devised was to use a metallic cartridge to hold the powder and to close up all the joints. Lefaucheux's pinfire cartridge. Sketch from a sample in the author's collection. A percussion cap, like the ones used in the old cap and ball revolvers, is held in a fiber holder inside the end of the cartridge. Each cartridge contains its own firing pin, as shown, which projects through a slot in the breech of the barrel or cylinder, so as to be struck by the hammer in falling, and cracks in the breech. The cartridge is always made of soft metal, such as copper or brass, which expands from the effect of the internal pressure, and hugs the walls of the chamber so tightly that no gas can escape past it except from the front end, and it covers up the cracks at the rear so that no gas can get through in that direction. Different kinds of cartridges. The first type of metallic cartridge to become popular was what is known as the pinfire type. Cartridges of this kind have a primer or cap inside and a little pin like a short nail sticking out of the side. There is a slot in the breech of the gun barrel or revolver cylinder for this pin to stick through, and in firing the gun, the hammer drives the pin downward into the cartridge, discharging the cap. Pinfire cartridges are still used occasionally in many foreign guns, but are comparatively rare in America. Another rimfire cartridge that is still used to a certain extent, and for which an arm is still made, is the .41 short used in the deadly little Derringer pistols. The Remington Arms Company still make the .41 double Derringer. Years ago, rifles and revolvers using the .32 and .38 caliber rimfire cartridges were popular. These guns are no longer made, but the cartridges can still be purchased. Then there are .25 caliber and .41 caliber rimfire rifle cartridges that are still made and sold. The student should become familiar with all of these cartridges. Centerfire cartridges. While the rimfire cartridge still enjoys enormous popularity in the .22 caliber, it has been superseded in practically every other caliber by the later type known as the centerfire cartridge. This is a brass cartridge with a thick, heavy head, containing a percussion cap or primer, pressed into a circular recess in the center. A flash hole in the center of the primer pocket communicates with the powder space inside. The cartridge is filled with powder and carries a bullet in its open end. Component parts of loaded cartridge: A. Primer or cap. B. Case or shell. C. Powder or charge. D. Bullet, projectile or ball. F. The assembled cartridge around a fixed ammunition or a load. The .885, and W. Special, a rim type of cartridge. E. A rimless type of cartridge loaded with a metal-cased bullet held friction-tight by the neck of the case. F. Illustrates a lead bullet held in place by crimping over the mouth of the case. Both cartridges are loaded with smokeless powder, and the cases are cannulured to prevent the bullet from slipping down on. The powder, These cartridges are made by punching discs from a sheet of brass, and then drawing these discs out into tubes, closed at one end. When brass is heated, it becomes very soft and ductile, and very weak. When it is drawn or otherwise worked, it becomes hard, strong, and elastic. The heating of brass to make it soft, so that it can be worked with ease, is called annealing. When cartridges are to be used with high-pressure loads, the walls of the case, near the head, must be quite thick and strong, because the chamber is often cut away at the back for the extractor of is tapered to make the cartridges feed easily in repeating arms. And at this cut-away portion, all that lies between the outside world and the high powder pressure inside when the gun is fired is the wall of the case, which bridges the gap. If it is made too weak or soft, it will blow out and allow the gas to escape, with possible disastrous consequences. Moreover, the head of the case, which rests on the breech block of the arm, must also be made hard and strong, to prevent it from expanding and allowing the primer pocket to enlarge and permit the escape of gas. On the other hand, the primer, which is made of brass or copper, must be quite soft to allow the firing pin to dent it in, and thus crush the percussion mixture inside. When the cartridge is fired, the entire gas pressure acts on the inside of the cartridge head to force it back against the face of the breech, and the soft metal of the primer usually takes a good impression of the fine scratches, tool marks, or file marks on the face of the breech. The head of the cartridge itself also very often takes good imprints of these marks, but it does not do this as readily as does the primer, because it is made of harder material, as was explained above. If the chamber of the gun is oily, so that the cartridge can slip back to the rear easily, the pressure of the cartridge head on the breech block is increased, and the marks are more pronounced. Copper primers take a better impression than do the harder brass ones. There is a big variation in makes and types of ammunition in this respect. Sometimes very abundant prints, which are excellent for identification, are obtained. At other times, the prints obtained on the primer or the head of the case may be very few or none at all, and identification by this means may fail entirely. The Burden primer. There is a difference in the internal construction of the primer and cartridge case between the American and the European standard practice of manufacture, which may at times aid the expert in determining the origin of the cartridge. This difference is in the anvil of the primer and the flash hole or holes leading from the primer pocket through the head of the cartridge. When the firing pin strikes the primer, it dents the metal in, and the object of this denting is to crush the priming composition against another metallic surface situated inside the primer, called the anvil. In American practice, this anvil is a separate little piece of brass inside the primer, while in the European manufacture, the anvil is a little point sticking out in the bottom of the primer cup, formed from the metal of the cartridge case itself. In American practice, there is only one flash hole, and this is in the center of the primer cup. But in the European practice, the center of the primer cup is occupied by the anvil, and there are 2 or 3 flash holes to the sides of the center. The American Type-Knopf primer is called the separate anvil type, while the European is called the Burden type, after the American inventor Colonel Burden. See illustration on page 277 in Textbook of Pistols and Revolvers. By looking into the fired cartridge case, it can readily be determined whether or not it is of American make, for if it has but one flash hole and that in the center, it is of the American type, while if it has 2 or more flash holes, one on each side of the center, it is of the Burden type. This can, of course, also be determined by removing the primer. To remove the primer of an American type cartridge, a small punch is inserted through the flash hole, and the primer is driven out, while to remove a Burden primer, the case is filled full of water, and a bullet or other tightly fitting plug is inserted into the front end of the case, and then supporting the head of the case on each side. So the primer is unsupported, the bullet or plug is struck a sharp blow with a hammer, when the pressure of the water will force the primer out of its seating. But the investigator will not want to remove the primer of an evidence cartridge case, for such evidence exhibits must not be changed. It will be well for the reader to realize that while the present practice is for the Burden primer to be made and used only in foreign ammunition, there are a few exceptions that have occurred in the past. The Burden primer was invented in the United States and was used here in some of the early cartridges, but was superseded by the separate anvil type some 40 or more years ago. However, during the World War, at least one of the American cartridge companies which made military ammunition on contract for foreign governments used the Burden primer. Then in 1930, the government arsenal at Frankfurt made a few Burden type .30 caliber rifle cartridges for the national matches, in connection with experiments made on non-corrosive priming. Rimless and semi-rim cartridges. When the cartridge is put into the gun, There must be something to stop it from going all the way into the gun barrel and to support it against the firing pin blow. And there must also be something for the extractor to hook onto to pull the empty case out of the gun after it is fired. Most cartridges are made with a rint around the head, and this rim fulfills both the functions mentioned above. However, a raised rim of this kind interferes with the loading of cartridges from a box magazine, such as is used in automatic pistols and in military repeating rifles, and cartridges intended for use in these arms are often made without a raised rim. Instead, they have a groove cut around the head for the extractor to hook into. These cartridges are said to be of the rimless type. The .30 caliber U.S. government cartridge used in the Springfield rifle is rimless. It is a bottlenecked cartridge which has a body that is larger than the bullet, and the slope or shoulder, where the neck of the cartridge joins the body, bears against a corresponding slope in the chamber, and thus forms a fixed seating for the cartridge and supports it against the blow of the firing pin. Many other high-powered rifle cartridges are made in the rimless, bottleneck type. The .45 automatic pistol cartridge is also rimless, and as this is a perfectly straight cartridge with no taper or bottleneck, some different method must be used for seating it and supporting it against the firing pin blow. This is done by leaving the front edge of the case perfectly square and seating it against a corresponding shoulder at the front end of the chamber. This means that the front edge of the cartridge case cannot be crimped onto the bullet, but must be left perfectly square, and that the bullet must be held in place in the neck of the case by friction only. See sketch on page 278, Textbook of Pistols and Revolvers. The .25, .32, and .38 automatic pistol cartridges, and the .32, .35, .351, and .401 Winchester self-loading rifle cartridges, which at first glance seem to be rimless, have no square edge to the front of the cartridge case, as the case is crimped into a groove or cannelure around the bullet. In these cartridges, the rim is made just a little bit bigger than the diameter of the case, so that there is really a slight bearing of the rim against the back end of the chamber. These are not strictly rimless cartridges, but are what is more properly called semi-rim. Rimless pistol cartridges are designed primarily for use in automatics, but there are also some revolvers, such as the Colt and Smith & Wesson Model 1917 revolvers, which use the .45 automatic pistol cartridge. Cannelure on cartridge case. The observant user of firearms will note that many pistol cartridges have a groove, or cannelure, around the case just back of the bullet. This is to keep the bullet from being pushed all the way in onto the powder. Usually, this cannelure is not seen on cartridges loaded with black powder, for two reasons. First, the charge of black powder fills or nearly fills the powder space, and so the bullet cannot go too far in, because it is stopped when its base comes against the powder charge. And second, it makes no difference in the burning of the powder if the bullet does rest on or compress the charge. Thus, in the days of black powder, no cartridge cases had cannelures. But when smokeless powder came in, two new conditions arose. First, smokeless powder is much more concentrated, so that it only partly filled the powder space. And second, it is very sensitive to changes in powder space or to compression. Under these conditions, some method of limiting the backward motion of the bullet had to be provided, and the cannelure was devised for this purpose. There is, of course, nothing to prevent the use of a cannelured case for both black and smokeless loads. But many makers still put their black powder loads in plain uncannelured cases, as an aid in identifying the two kinds and keeping them separated in the factory. Some years ago, there was another way of telling a black powder cartridge from one loaded with smokeless. That was the difference in the appearance of the primer. Smokeless powder requires a stronger primer than that necessary for black powder, and when smokeless powder first became popular, special primers were used for smokeless loads, and these smokeless powder primers were often marked with an initial or monogram of the maker. This practice has now been discontinued, as all primers now made are intended for use with smokeless powder, and are also used when the cartridge is loaded with black powder. Corrosive and non-corrosive primers. In recent years, there has been a change in the general practice of primer construction that is of importance to the firearms identification expert, for it entirely changes what had previously been the rule for judging how long it had been since an arm was fired. The change referred to is the almost universal adoption in America of non-corrosive primers, which were first introduced into this country in the .22 caliber rimfire, though they had already been known and used in Europe for some time previously. Before this change, it was necessary to clean a gun promptly and thoroughly after firing, if serious rusting and corrosion was to be avoided. It was definitely determined that the cause of this trouble lay entirely in a certain product of the combustion of the primer, and by suitable changes the deleterious salt was eliminated, and with present-day smokeless powder, a gun which has been fired can lie for weeks without cleaning, and during this time there will be no changes that will serve to tell how long ago it was fired. Bullets in the old black powder days, all bullets were made of plain lead, or of lead hardened and strengthened slightly by the addition of a small percentage of tin, or of antimony, or both. This hardening helps to keep the bullet from stripping or jumping the rifling, and also helps to reduce the tendency for the lead to adhere to the barrel in patches, a trouble that is known as leading. Low-power rifle bullets, including the .22 caliber ones, and most revolver bullets are still made in this way. They are usually lubricated with a grease or lubricating compound, for unless this is done, there will be very bad leading of the barrel. Some lead bullets are plated with cadmium instead of being lubricated, and this helps to prevent leading, but will not prevent it altogether if a series of shots are fired rapidly, as from an automatic pistol such as the Colt Woodsman. In some companies, in an effort to further reduce the tendency to lead, the bullets are plated with a very thin coating of copper, or of a compound known by the trade name of luballoy, lubricating alloy, which really is mostly copper with a very small percentage of tin and zinc added. The copper-plated or luballoy-plated bullets are usually lubricated. The lubrication is placed in cannelures or grooves around the bullet. The earliest bullets were made with a reduced portion or heel which fits into the neck of the cartridge case, and the portion of the bullet forward of the heel is of the same diameter as the outside of the cartridge case. This forward portion of the bullet is provided with one or more grooves which are filled with lubricant, or in some cases there is no groove at all, and the forward portion of the bullet is lubricated by simply being dipped into melted grease. Cartridges of this kind are said to be outside lubricated, and are messy and sticky to handle. A number of the cartridges which were originated many years ago, and consequently were designed in this way, are still made with the outside lubricant. Examples are the .22 short, long, and long rifle, the .38 short Colt, the .41 short, and others. The cartridges of more modern origin are designed in what is known as the inside lubricated type. In these, the bullet has no heel of reduced diameter to fit the cartridge case. Instead, the body of the bullet forward of the case is the same diameter as the part inside, and the case is therefore larger than the bullet. The grooves for the lubricant are in the part of the bullet that is inside the cartridge case, and therefore the grease is all covered by the sidewalls of the cartridge case. The exposed part of the bullet is free from grease, and the cartridges are clean to handle. When a lead bullet is fired, the soft metal expands sideways under the impact of the pressure on its base, and fills every available bit of space in the barrel. Thus it fills the grooves of the rifling and takes an excellent impression of the surface. Any little elevations in the surface will plow through the soft surface and leave a corresponding scratch, and any grooves in the surface of the barrel, especially if they are at the muzzle, will leave corresponding ridges on the bullet. Jacketed bullets, with the advent of smokeless powder, higher velocities became possible, but it was soon found that the ordinary lead or lead alloy bullets described above would not stand these velocities without stripping or jumping the rifling, or having the surface melted. This led to the introduction of what is known as the metal jacketed type of bullet, which is now standard for use in high-powered rifles, and which is also almost universally used in automatic pistols, on account of the added strength it gives the bullet to stand the feeding through the magazine and mechanism. In this type of bullet, there is a hollow case or bullet jacket formed out of copper-nickel, gilding metal, or soft steel, and the lead core or main part of the bullet is placed inside this harder envelope, and the bullet is then swedged to its final shape in a heavy press, which turns over the edges of the jacket at the base of the bullet so as to hold the core firmly in place. There are several different types and kinds of metal jacketed bullets made. The ordinary military bullet is open at the base and has the point covered with the jacket. But for hunting, the base is often closed and the point left uncovered so that the soft lead core shows. This is called a soft point, mushroom, or dum-dum bullet. When it strikes a resisting object, the lead at the point expands or mushrooms, and the bullet thus becomes much more deadly as it tears a larger hole. Sometimes there is a hole in the point of the bullet, which greatly facilitates the expansion on impact. A bullet with a hole in the point is called a hollow point or express bullet. Some of these soft point bullets have the disadvantage, when they are used in rifles with a box magazine, of having the points tend to batter in the magazines from the shock of recoil or from other causes. For this reason, it is quite common to find various different patented constructions used to protect the point, and at the same time allow the point to expand when it strikes game. For example, there may be a small peg or point of copper insert in the very end of the soft point. In the military ammunition, there are several special kinds found which are not ordinarily made in commercial ammunition. For example, there is the armor-piercing cartridge, which has a hardened steel core inside the bullet. At short ranges, this will pierce a half-inch or more of armor plate, on which an ordinary jacketed bullet would simply make a gray splash. Then there is the tracer bullet. The front part of the jacket has a short lead core in it that does not fill the whole jacket. The bottom of the jacket is filled with a chemical composition, generally containing magnesium, barium peroxide, and barium nitrate, or some other such mixture. This is pressed into the base of the bullet under great pressure, so that it seems almost as hard as a rock. When the gun is fired, this tracer compound ignites and burns with a brilliant flame which is visible as the bullet flies along, and thus makes it easy to see where the shot has gone. Tracer cartridges of this kind are made in the .45 caliber automatic cartridge for the Thompson submachine gun. The jacketed bullets do not expand as readily under the effect of the gas pressure on the base as do the lead ones first described. The metal-cased or metal-jacketed bullet is made by enclosing a core or slug of lead alloy in an envelope of harder and stronger metal. The standard practice in America is to make the jacket of copper-nickel, gilding metal, or lubelloy, while in Europe the jacket is often made of steel plated with gilding metal or with cupronickel. The sketch shows the method of construction. A is the core of a .45 caliber automatic pistol bullet, B is the jacket, and C is the assembled bullet, made by inserting the core A in the jacket B, and then swaging the two together under heavy pressure, at the same time crimping the edges of the jacket over the base of the core as shown. In making a soft point bullet, shown at the right, the jacket is made closed at the base and open at the point, and the core is inserted from the front and then is crimped onto the core as shown. The cannelure or groove around the bullet serves not only as a place into which the front of the cartridge case may be crimped, but also as a method of giving the jacket an additional hold on the core. Ordinarily, they do not fill up the grooves completely, and often a jacketed bullet will show the marks left by the friction of the barrel only where the tops of the lands of the rifling bore, and for a small space in the center of the groove marks on the bullet. The bullet is likely to have far less of the fine identifying scratches than are left on a lead bullet, but this is counterbalanced by the fact that the marks on the surface of the lead bullet are more easily obliterated by impact with hard surfaces, by the mashing of the bullet on impact, or by rough handling during extraction from the body, while those on the jacketed bullets will persist, even when the bullet has struck some hard object. Sometimes, when a soft point bullet strikes an animal or other object, the jacket will open up at the point, and the lead core will leave the jacket and be lost while the jacket will be recovered. In such cases, the jacket will retain the barrel markings perfectly. The reader should understand the difference between the copper or lubelloy-plated lead bullets, first mentioned, and the jacketed bullets. In the plated bullets, the bullet covering is just a very thin film, perhaps 1 or 2 10,000ths of an inch thick, while the drawn jacket of the metal-cased bullet is from 25 to 30 thousandths of an inch in thickness. The lead bullets, that have the thin plating of copper or lubelloy, are much more difficult to identify than the plain lead ones, because in the plated ones, the plating breaks up into irregular flakes covering the surface, which make the comparison of the markings a particularly annoying task. It may be stated here that the metal jacketed bullets are not lubricated, for the metal does not adhere to the barrel as easily as does the plain lead, and therefore lubrication is not necessary. But sometimes, particularly with the copper-nickel jacketed bullets, a portion of the metal of the jacket does adhere in patches to the inside of the barrel, most often near the muzzle. This condition is called metal fouling, and a metal-fouled barrel will tear the surface of the bullet very badly, and therefore this condition may have quite a definite bearing on the identification of the gun which fired a given bullet. For example, if a bullet is fired from a barrel which afterwards picks up metal fouling, identification may be rendered difficult. If the crime bullet is fired from a badly fouled barrel, a test bullet fired from the same barrel immediately afterward may be easier to identify. If the barrel picks up more fouling before the test bullet is fired, identification is harder or may be impossible. If the metal fouling is removed after the evidence bullet is fired, and before the test bullet is obtained, identification may fail. When the old copper-nickel jacketed model of 1906 bullets were being used in the Army, the use of an ammonia solution to remove metal fouling was routine. Now that the service bullet is jacketed with gilding metal, metal fouling is of rare occurrence in the Army rifle. But many hunting bullets are still made with copper-nickel jackets, and the possible occurrence of metal fouling and its bearing on the question of identification should be borne in mind. Metal fouling can be recognized on visual inspection by the appearance of small raised patches inside the bore near the muzzle. The author's simple barrel telescope, described in another chapter, can be used to great advantage in looking for this condition. It should be noted that jacketed bullets made in America are always covered either with gilding metal, which is an alloy of approximately 90 parts copper and 10 parts zinc, or with cupronickel, which is 60 parts copper and 40 parts of nickel, and is a white metal looking like German silver. There is no such thing as a steel jacketed bullet made in America. On the other hand, steel either heavily coated with copper-nickel or not coated at all is the favorite jacket material for European-made ammunition. This fact in itself may sometimes be of use in clarifying circumstances surrounding a crime and pointing investigators in the right direction. Two men who might possibly have been involved in a shooting affair in which the victim was killed with a small .32 caliber bullet were each found to have in their possession a partly used box of .32 caliber cartridges. The cartridges belonging to A were of domestic make, while those belonging to B were imported. The investigator applied a magnet to the fatal bullet and found that it was attracted to the magnet, thereby proving that it had a steel jacket, indicating the probable innocence of A. It should also be remembered that bullets are rarely made of pure lead, but frequently are made of a lead alloy consisting of a mixture of lead and some other metal such as tin, or antimony, or both, this material being added in order to make the bullet harder. Moreover, birdshot may contain a certain percentage of arsenic. Thus, the bullet metal may furnish valuable evidence if a chemical analysis or other test is made to determine the character of the bullet material. Among the other tests which could be used instead of chemical analysis might be mentioned a test of specific gravity, as both tin and antimony are lighter than lead and the addition of these materials changes the specific gravity of the bullet. It is mentioned in this place because every investigator should realize the possibilities of gaining information from this source, and if the case seems to warrant it, he can recommend that an analysis or test of this character be made. Bullet cannelures. The word cannelure is often heard in connection with ammunition. It simply means a groove of any kind around a cylindrical portion of either a cartridge case or a bullet. Most lead bullets have several cannelures, which were originally provided for the sole purpose of holding a supply of grease or lubricant, by which the bore is kept oiled to prevent the lead of the bullet from rubbing off under the intense heat and friction of the passage through the bat rail. Unless the bullet is properly lubricated, or some other steps are taken to prevent it, the lead will solder itself to the surface of the barrel in lumps and patches. And once this action starts, the patch adhering to the surface will scrape off more lead from each succeeding bullet, until the barrel may actually become choked up in extreme cases. Cannelures also enable the maker to add cannelures on lead bullets. The way in which differences in the form, appearance, and location of the cannelures can assist in identifying the make of a bullet is quickly apparent from the sketch. It shows 4 bullets of the same caliber and, of approximately the same date of manufacture, from the 4 leading American cartridge factories, somewhat to the length of a lead bullet, yet keep its weight to a minimum. Generally, lead bullets have 2 or more of such grooves, which differ very decidedly among the various makes and types of bullets. These grooves are rolled into the sides of the bullet by means of rotating discs with a corrugated rim, called knurling discs, or just knurls. The operation of putting these corrugations onto a metal surface is called knurling, and the resulting rough surface is said to be knurled. The knurling heads naturally vary in size, shape, width, and particularly in the pattern of the knurling, between the different makers. Thus, one maker may roll out a square-bottomed cannelure, while another makes a deep circular one, and still a third may roll a shallow oval into the sides of his bullets. Then one maker's knurling may consist of a row of closely spaced, straight lines. Another's may consist of the same kind of lines spaced further apart. Then slanting lines might be used, or checkering, or small dots, etc. The differences between the different makes, and even between a single maker's product of different dates, will be readily noticed, and is often very distinctive. The main trouble in identifying these cannelure markings is that the soft lead bullet may be so smashed up and distorted that there are not enough clear markings remaining to compare. But it takes only a short stretch of undistorted markings to establish a check. An examination of the cannelure markings may help the investigator in several ways. one of which, for example, is to give an indication as to whether or not the evidence bullet is of the same kind as those from a partly used box found in the possession of the suspect. While it may be a practical impossibility to trace bullets clear back to the maker by means of such markings, it is often an extremely easy matter to say by their aid whether or not cartridges in the possession of a suspect are of the same type as those from which the evidence bullet was fired. Several years ago, a friend of the writer's who is particularly well qualified in the field of firearms investigation was unexpectedly called as a witness in a homicide trial and hustled into the courtroom by the defense lawyer without a minute's notice, and much against his will was compelled to give testimony which actually acquitted the Negro under trial. It appears that as soon as he got upon the witness stand and was handed the main exhibits in the case, consisting of 2 lead .38s and W bullets taken from the murdered Negro's skull, together with the remains of a box of similar unfired cartridges taken from the room of the accused, he at once saw that the bullets were of an exactly similar type, as this was indicated conclusively by the cannelure size, shape, and marking, and by the size, shape, and hardness of the bullets. But it was rendered impossible for him to explain this by the attitude of the prosecuting attorney, who was doing his best to hang the prisoner, and therefore took a hard-boiled attitude with this witness because he had been introduced by the defense. He compelled the witness to answer yes or no, and came near having him fined for contempt of court when in response to certain questions he would have explained the points of similarity. By his hard-boiled attitude this district attorney lost his case, for the witness, who well knew that the bullets showed many points of similarity, was not allowed to say anything about it, and the defendant was acquitted. When it comes to metal-cased bullets, there is no need of grease grooves, as full-patch or metal-jacketed bullets cannot lead the barrel, and usually are not lubricated. It may be said, in passing, that they may cause metal fouling, which is the adherence FO the barrel of metal rubbed off of the copper-nickel or gilding metal jacket. Sometimes, especially with high-velocity rifles, where the friction in the barrel is great, metal fouling with copper-nickel jacketed bullets may reach very annoying proportions. But with gilding metal jackets it is much less often seen, and with low-velocity weapons like pistols and revolvers it is hardly ever heard of. While the full-jacketed or soft-point bullets do not have grease grooves, they usually do have one cannelure, which is used for the purpose of crimping the bullet firmly into place in the cartridge. In revolvers, the recoil of the gun jerks back the other unfired cartridges in the cylinder, and may thus cause the bullets to move forward in the cases enough to jam the cylinder from rotating, unless those bullets are crimped in place. In automatic pistols, the cartridges in the magazine are bumped on the nose each time the gun recoils, and if the bullets were loose in the necks of the cases, they might be driven down on top of the powder, which would raise the pressure. For these and other reasons, the bullet must be held firmly in place in the neck of the cartridge. Therefore, in most cartridges with metal-jacketed bullets, it will be found that there is a cannelure rolled into the metal of the jacket at the point where the end of the case comes, and the case is crimped into this cannelure. This is the practice in America, but in Europe, quite a different method is often employed. Especially in rifle cartridges they use what is called the segmental crimp, where the neck of the case is compressed into the soft metal of the bullet by having the cartridge put into a fixture where several jaws close in onto the neck of the cartridge at the same time. Each jaw covers one segment of the circumference, hence the name. Another very popular European method is to make a groove or smooth cannelure in the bullet at some point which will lie inside the neck of the cartridge, and then indent several segments of the neck into this groove. This system is found in both rifle and pistol cartridge. While the main function of the cannelure in metal-cased bullets is to form a seat for the crimping of the cartridge case, as has just been described, it may and often does serve other purposes. With a soft-nosed bullet having the front end exposed, and a jacket over the base, the maker may feel that several rows of knurling will help to hold the jacket to the core of the bullet and avoid the possibility of having the jacket stick in the bore of the gun, while the core goes on, a thing that has been known to happen. The writer has before him at this instant a .33 Winchester bullet of this type, with 3 knurled cannelures, of which one is used as the crimping groove, and the other 2 are covered by the neck of the cartridge case. This was formerly common practice, but the advent of thicker jackets has rendered it unnecessary, and today only one cannelure is ordinarily seen on full jacketed bullets. Then there are several distinctive markings that are put on bullets in connection with some patented system of causing them to expand or mushroom in order to increase their effectiveness for hunting. For example, one type has a jacket extending all the way up to the point which has a small hole in it, and near the point the jacket has a row of slashes or indentations running back toward the base for a short distance. These are for the purpose of assisting the bullet to break up or enlarge on impact, in order to deliver a more smashing impact and give a more killing wound. Another type of recently developed hunting bullet has an enlarged portion or band running around it behind the point to confine all the breaking up to the front part and retain the rear portion intact. Any and all such distinctive marks may be of the very greatest assistance to the investigator in determining such interesting and useful information as, for example, whether or not the fatal bullet is of the same kind as several unfired ones found in the magazine or unfired chambers of the suspect's weapon, or in a partly used box of ammunition in his possession. The possible importance of such observations may be judged by the fact that the author has just this moment pulled the 4 bullets from 4 different makes of .30-06 rifle ammunition, each of which had but one crimping groove rolled into its side. Yet there was absolutely no difficulty in matching each make with the aid of a simple pocket lens. Hand-loaded cartridges, in addition to factory-made ammunition manufactured and loaded by the various commercial makers. There is always the possibility that the investigator may encounter an instance where hand-loaded or home-made ammunition has been used. For many target shots and gun experimenters make a practice of casting their own bullets and then loading them by hand into cartridge cases. No matter how perfectly the bullet is cast, it is always possible to see the ridge or dividing line which runs lengthwise of both sides and across the nose of the bullet, marking the place where the joint came between the 2 halves of the mold. Moreover, the bases of home-cast bullets, except the specially cast hollow base type, will be square across and not cupped or hollow, as are most of the factory-made ones. And there will be a small rough spot where the sprue was cut off by the swinging gate through which the pouring is done. In rare instances, the hand loader may cast hollow base bullets. In molds for these bullets, the swinging gate is at the point, and it will therefore always be flat or nearly so, because the sprue will be cut off there. An experienced shooter can tell at a glance whether a bullet is hand-cast or factory-swaged. The hand-cast bullets have a brighter and more silvery look than do the factory-made ones, and the lubrication and crimping grooves are cast into the bullet and show the same shade of metal. Factory-made bullets usually have the grooves rolled or knurled into the body as a separate operation, and these grooves are often made in corrugated, knurled, or pinhead patterns. Factory bullets usually have the base slightly concave or dished in, or have a raised rim around the edge, and the surface will have a dull oxidized look with slight dents all over it, which are caused by the manner in which hundreds of pounds of these bullets are handled and kept together in factory trucks and containers. The color and character of the lubricant may be a further guide, as the factories use a light-colored lubricant with a wax base, while the individual is likely to use a softer mixture, dark brown in color, known as banana lubricant, because it smells somewhat like a banana. No one can predict what combination of components or calibers may be prepared and used by the experimentally inclined individual. It is entirely possible to load pistol bullets into rifle cartridges and shoot them with perfect results, or to do many other things which would cause the inexperienced investigator no end of perplexity. But if the student will take pains to become familiar with the practices of hand loaders, and with the appearance of their products, he should have no great trouble from this cause. Crimping the bullet in the case. Obviously, the bullet must be held fast in the cartridge case in some way, so that it will not move from its position from the force of recoil or from any other reason. Most commonly, the bullet is provided with a crimping groove or cannelure, and the open end of the cartridge case is rolled, pressed, or otherwise crimped over into this groove so as to hold the bullet firmly in place. Some metal-jacketed bullets do not have any cannelure and are held in place merely by friction. An example is the .45 caliber automatic pistol bullet, which is made today, is proportioned so as to be a tight fit in the neck of the case, and is forced into place where it is held by the elastic tension of the brass. This method of holding the bullet in place is fairly common. The stab marks show plainly on the bullet after firing, was stretched when the bullet was inserted. Sometimes, however, these bullets are further held by stabbing 3 little dents into the brass with a sharp punch, so that the brass is driven more or less into the surface of the jacket. This stabbing is rather often found on automatic pistol bullets. Such stab marks will remain after the bullet is fired, and are very distinctive in appearance. Besides the ordinary circular crimp, there are at least 2 other types of what is termed key segmental crimp, in which the cartridge case is pressed in over only a part of its circumference in 3 places. Some English cartridges have a cannelure on the bullet somewhat below the mouth of the case, and the crimp dents the case into this cannelure in 3 wide segments. In the German service rifle cartridge and some others, the segmental crimp is used at the very mouth of the case and there is no cannelure, the bullet jacket merely being dented in under the pressed-in portions of the case. The segmental or partial crimp of the .30 caliber ML cartridge, with the end of the case crimped firmly into a deep cannelure in the bullet. When not loaded, this component is called a case, and the cartridge when fired is, among other names, referred to as an empty. In very rare instances, shotgun ammunition is made with an all-brass case like that of a rifle cartridge. The shotgun cartridge is a centerfire affair, primed just like a centerfire rifle or pistol cartridge, and is loaded with powder, shot, and wads in the following order. First, there is the charge of powder, which may be either black powder or one of the various kinds of bulk or dense smokeless powders. This powder is tamped down and held in place by 2 or more, generally 3 thick wads. Then comes the charge of shot, and on top of this is a thin, but stout, cardboard wad which closes up the end and holds the shot charge in place. The end of the paper case is turned over or crimped down on the thin top wad, thus holding the components all firmly in position. Usually this top wad has the name or trademark of the maker, and the size of the shot, and sometimes the load of powder, stamped on one or both of its sides. There are but few sizes or calibers of shotgun cartridges made, and the size of a shotgun or its ammunition is not referred to in calibers, as is rifle or pistol ammunition, but instead is named by the gauge or bore. Though there are a few exceptions, such as the 4 and 9mm shotguns and the popular .410 gauge, which strictly speaking is a .41 or .410 caliber, though in keeping with the usual shotgun practice, it is always referred to as .410 gauge. The word gauge, used in this connection, was originally derived from the diameter of a solid lead ball which would just fit the gun, and indicates the number of those balls that will go to make up a pound in weight. Thus, a 12-gauge gun would be of such a diameter of bore that a ball of the same diameter would weigh 1-12 th of a pound, and in the same way, a 16-gauge ball would weigh 1 ounce. But the balls now loaded to be fired as solid or single-ball loads in shotguns are smaller than these figures would indicate, in order to allow for the choke of the muzzle, which is a constriction intended to prevent the shot pattern from spreading too much at long ranges. Modern American shotguns come in 10, 12, 16, 20, 28, and .410 gauges. In addition, but now obsolete in the United States, there are 4, 8, 14, and 24 gauge arms. The 8-gauge and sometimes even 4-gauge guns are still occasionally seen, but the writer has never known of the use of a 14 or 24-gauge gun in this country. In the rural and backwoods sections, the size of a shotgun is often referred to as its number. Thus, a man may go into a store to buy some number 12 shotgun shells or may tell you he uses and prefers a number 12 gun. One soon learns to determine the gauge of a shotgun, its ammunition, wadding, etc. by eye alone. But in case of doubt, a comparison with unfired components will soon settle the point. However, for the benefit of those who may desire to know the accurate dimensions, we give below the diameters of the standard shotgun bores and also the diameter of the wadding. It will be noted that the diameter of the wadding is greater than that of the gun bore. This is proper and customary, but in actual practice the wad diameters will vary considerably and may be much greater than the figures given, particularly in the case of the soft felt wadding, which must act as a gas check and seal the bore while the shot are traveling out ahead of the powder gases. The actual difference, however, will be so small as hardly to be noticeable, and can be told only by the slight variation in the number of pellets to the ounce. In addition to familiarizing himself with the different sizes of shot, the investigator should make a close study of the wadding used by the different makers and learn to identify the various felt and cardboard gun wads. Many different materials, such as felt, linoleum, cork, paper, leather, etc., may be used in the manufacture of these wads, and sometimes certain patented shapes will be seen. Each maker has his own particular practice in assembling the different combinations with his own distinct colors and sizes, and a study of all this will help greatly in enabling the investigator to correctly identify any wadding which may be involved in an intentional homicide or a shooting accident with the shotgun. It is, however, impossible to give all these data in a complete form for reference, as the practice of any maker is subject to change at any time, and what is correct today will perhaps be entirely different tomorrow. The investigator will do well to make a close study of shotshell loading practices and components and keep constantly abreast of current practices, with particular attention to improvements that are always being made in the art. It is an easy and entirely safe practice to cut open the paper case of a loaded shotgun cartridge and see accurately how it is assembled and how the different components are used. Cut a longitudinal strip from the paper case, dump the powder into a pill vial, and preserve it and the wadding and shot for future reference and study, being careful to label it correctly as to maker, type, and date. Ammunition terms and names. Ammunition for the various type firearms is spoken of in several different ways, and distinctive terms are used in various sections of the country, any of which may be correct. The word ammunition, of course, means any unfired assembly of primer, powder, and ball which might be used in a firearm, but today the word is generally used when referring to a supply of assembled cartridges in bulk, as in boxes, cases, or carloads. However, ammunition is often used to refer to the supply a person may be carrying in his pockets, although the term cartridges is about equally applied. Amongst the ammunition and firearms trade, shotgun cartridges are commonly referred to as shot shells, while rifle ammunition is spoken of as metallics, further divided into rimfires, which are mainly .22 caliber in these days, and centerfires, the latter comprising practically all calibers other than .22. When a trade representative uses the word cartridge, he invariably refers to some rifle or revolver metallic cartridge, while in speaking of any shotgun ammunition he will use the terms shells or shot shells mentioned above. The layman uses the above mentioned terms indiscriminately, although as a general rule he speaks of cartridges when referring to rifle or revolver ammunition, and shells when on the subject of shotguns. But a fired, empty cartridge case is invariably spoken of as a shell also, although the backwoodsman might speak about busted hulls and still be in good social standing in his local court, even though fired cases is the strictly correct designation. Amongst the uninitiated, the word bullet is most often misused as it is commonly applied to any sort of an unfired cartridge. Actually, the bullet is only that solid portion of a loaded rifle or pistol cartridge which leaves the muzzle of the gun, and which does the striking or killing. The word can really only be properly used in connection with rifle or revolver ammunition, but other common designations for the bullet are projectile and ball, the latter a relic of old muzzle loading days when all rifle projectiles were round, lead balls. Although there are available in special type, various patented bullets for use in modern shotguns, they are seldom seen in this country, and the word bullet is never correct in connection with shotgun ammunition as generally manufactured. The cloud of small, round projectiles which leave the muzzle of a fired shotgun are properly referred to as shot, or as the charge, or the load, while the individual round projectiles are properly termed pellet or shot. The entire charge, when moving through the air, can also be properly referred to as the pattern, although strictly speaking, the pattern is the registered strike of the entire load upon a paper target. Buckshot has its own peculiar appellations. The balls comprising the charge are often incorrectly referred to as slugs, while in many backwoods sections, particularly in the South, they may speak of the larger-sized buckshot as blue whistlers or whistlers, while the smaller sizes are called low molds. The use of the round, single lead ball in shotguns is very greatly restricted in this country, but is popular to a degree in some of the mountain sections of the East. Such loads are often locally referred to as pumpkins or pumpkin balls. In the chapter just completed, as well as the preceding one, the author has endeavored to define and describe briefly the commonly used, modern types of both firearms and ammunition. This subject has been treated from the viewpoint of, and for the use of, the police officer or lawyer who may have occasion to use this book, and who may not have had any great experience with firearms. It is possible that there may be some readers who may wish to go more deeply into the subjects just discussed, and for their benefit it may be said that there are in existence several excellent and suitable textbooks. In particular, I can recommend The Book of the Springfield by Captain E.C. Crossman, which is a most thorough and interesting work on high-velocity rifles and their ammunition, and Modern Shotguns and Loads by Captain Charles Askins, which is an equally authoritative work on the shotgun and its loads and ballistics. Both these volumes are produced by the publisher of this book. The user of a pistol or revolver should be interested in knowing as much as possible about the gunpowder which drives the bullet out of his weapon, and the firearms expert, especially the expert who expects to testify in court, must have a thorough knowledge of the principles of explosives, and at least a general knowledge of what types are in existence. For that reason, this chapter describes gunpowders and explosives in general without being confined to pistol powders only, on the principle that the reader who is not interested in going deeply into the subject may easily skip any portion not interesting to him, but which may be very useful to some other reader, especially the firearms expert. The name powder applied to bullet propellants is an interesting example of the way in which the original meaning of a word may be changed by common usage. Powder originally meant, and still does mean, fine dust. But at the present time we find substances called powder which do not in any manner resemble dust and which are not even finely divided. For instance, cannon powders are ordinarily made in big grains several inches long and perforated with longitudinal holes, or flat strips an inch wide and a foot or more long, or even in tubes 4 or 5 feet in length. The word powder was first applied to propellants used in firearms because the first propellant was a black dust or powder composed of ground-up charcoal, saltpeter, and sulfur. The reason that this mixture explodes when ignited is that it contains two fuels, charcoal and sulfur, which are very easily inflammable. And in addition it contains another solid substance which when heated gives off large quantities of oxygen. If charcoal and sulfur are mixed together in the air without the saltpeter, the result is a black substance that looks in all respects like the primitive gunpowder described above. And if it is ignited, it will burn, provided that plenty of air is supplied to support the combustion. The oxygen in the air enters into combustion with the charcoal to form carbon dioxide gas, and with the sulfur forms sulfur dioxide gas. However, there is no explosion because these gases can be formed only as fast as air can be brought in contact with the burning powder to supply the necessary oxygen for the combustion. In other words, this mixture of sulfur and charcoal would be a non-explosive powder. Now, when we mix powdered saltpeter with it, we change its nature so that it becomes an explosive powder. The minute it is lighted, it burns all at once without waiting for any air to come in contact with it. This is because the saltpeter is very rich in oxygen which it gives up when heated. Thus, the gunpowder supplies its own oxygen for combustion from within and can burn without any outside air. As nearly half the products of combustion of gunpowder are gases which occupy a great deal more space than the solids from which they were evolved, it is evident that the combustion of gunpowder results in a sudden expansion from the size of the original powder to the much larger size occupied by the gases which are driven off. It is this sudden expansion which causes the gunpowder to exert force when it is ignited. The heat of combustion adds to this effect because hot gases occupy more room than cold ones. Black powder relies for its explosive properties on three qualities which are typical of all explosives. First, when ignited it will burn by itself without aid from the outside air, and this burning is very rapid. Second, in burning it gives off a large amount of gas. Third, a considerable amount of heat is also evolved. To be successful for use as an explosive, a substance must possess all three of these qualities. We have seen above that there are substances which will burn and will give off a large amount of gas and heat, such as the mixture of charcoal and sulfur, but they do not burn without the aid of the outside air and consequently they do not burn rapidly enough. We do have substances that will burn without the aid of outside air and burn rather rapidly, but they must also give off a large amount of gas or else there is no explosion. Thermite, which is a mixture of oxide of iron with aluminum powder, will burn rapidly without air when ignited and it gives off great heat but it does not give off any gas, and therefore, there is no explosion. When this powder is burned it forms melted iron and slag which is aluminum oxide. Even though a substance can change from a solid to a gas without the addition of oxygen from the outside air, there will be no explosion unless the change from a solid to a gas involves the liberation of heat. Some substances change into gas rather rapidly, but in doing so, instead of giving off heat, they take up heat. Substances such as these do not cause an explosion when they decompose because as soon as they have started to decompose, they chill the surrounding air so much that the action comes to a stop until more heat can be supplied. A very familiar example is the dry ice in which ice cream is often packed. This is solid carbonic acid gas, and can exist in solid form only at an extremely low temperature. The minute dry ice is exposed to air, it begins to give off great quantities of gas. But in giving off this gas, it absorbs all the heat around it so that the gas can only be evolved as fast as the heat is supplied. Thus you can lay a big chunk of dry ice on a hot stove and it will sizzle, hiss and jump around for a long time but there will be no explosion. The basis of gunpowder is the substance which gives off oxygen, and that is the saltpeter. No doubt the original invention of gunpowder followed the discovery that when saltpeter is thrown into a fire, it crackles, hisses and makes the fire burn very much more brightly because of the oxygen it gives off. Then by mixing this saltpeter with incendiary materials, it was found that extremely hot fires could be made when the mixture was ignited. Finally, no doubt the proper combination was obtained so that when one of these mixtures was ignited it went off with a real explosion. The actual discovery of gunpowder is variously ascribed to the Hindus, to the Chinese, and to Roger Bacon, a German monk who seems to have described its composition in a manuscript written in 1249. Whoever may be the true inventor of gunpowder, guns and cannon were known before 1358. From this time until the discovery of gun cotton in 1846, black powder was the only explosive commonly known and used. The average composition of black powder is saltpeter 75 parts by weight, sulfur 10 parts, and charcoal 15 parts. There is, however, quite a wide variation in compositions that have been used in different years. Powders used for blasting, for example, are more effective if they do not operate quite as quickly as the ordinary gunpowder. This is for the reason that in blasting it is desired to rend the rocks and tear them out in chunks, rather than to break them up in fine pieces, which a stronger powder would do. The average blasting powder would have about 70 parts saltpeter, 14 sulfur and 16 charcoal, but some powders of this kind have been made with compositions as low in saltpeter as 40 parts, 30 sulfur and 30 charcoal. The speed of burning of black powder, and therefore to a certain degree its strength, is controlled by the size of granulation. Powder with extremely large grains burns more slowly than a fine grain powder and, therefore, is less sudden in its action. Moreover, large grain powder is much harder to ignite. As the size of the granulation decreases, the strength of the powder increases up to a certain point. However, when a powder is made very fine, like dust, the speed of burning is again reduced, because all the spaces between the grains are filled up, and hence there is no way for flame to communicate itself rapidly through the spaces and ignite the whole charge at one time, as would occur with powder where there is somewhat larger granulation. Powder with very small grains is the easiest to ignite, however, hence this kind of powder was used for priming charges in the old muzzle loaders. Black powder as at present made and sold to the trade comes in irregular, shiny, metallic-looking black grains designated as to size by the letters FG, FFG, FFFG, etc. The more Fs, the finer the grain. There is also a special granulation used in the Army for saluting purposes called Grade A1. I have often been asked just what these different designations mean as to size. This is a rather difficult question because the designations vary with the different manufacturers, but taking the DuPont company system, the values would be as given in the table below. The powders are measured by screening them through a coarse screen which catches all the very large lumps, letting the rest fall onto a fine screen which allows all the very fine powder to pass through. The screens through which the different grades of powder must pass and on which they must be retained are given in the table, the figures representing the number of meshes per .inch in the screen. Size must be retained on grade A, 1610, FG 1416, FFG 1624, FFFG 24, 46, FFFFG 46, 60 nitro explosives. The discovery of nitroglycerin in 1846 opened a new field of explosives. Nitroglycerin is one of the strongest explosives known and is the basis of many modern explosive compounds. It is a colorless, oily liquid formed by the action of nitric and sulfuric acids on glycerin. Nitroglycerin differs from gunpowder in that it is not a mixture of fuels and oxidizing agents. Instead, it is a chemical compound containing a large amount of oxygen, and this chemical compound is capable of rearranging itself into more stable compounds which are gases. A sharp shock will cause this rearranging process to start, and when once started it spreads almost instantly throughout the entire mass, thus resulting in a violent explosion. Nitroglycerin is inconvenient to use by itself, as it is subject to leakage and thin films of nitroglycerin leaking out on the outside of containers are subject to friction which might easily cause disastrous explosions. Moreover, pure nitroglycerin is dangerously sensitive. It was soon found that unless something could be done to overcome these disadvantages, nitroglycerin would never attain great popularity as an explosive. The difficulty was finally overcome by the discovery that nitroglycerin absorbed into a porous substance made a much safer and more convenient explosive than the pure nitroglycerin. One of the most successful methods of using it was to allow the nitroglycerin to be absorbed in a porous earth called kieselguhr. Nitroglycerin absorbed in a porous substance of this kind is called dynamite. Another very powerful explosive, which like nitroglycerin is a chemical compound and not a mixture, is gun cotton. This is formed by the action of nitric and sulfuric acid on cotton or any other kind of cellulose. Hence, we often hear the term nitrocellulose used instead of gun cotton. Gun cotton has the quality of being a substance which burns with extreme rapidity. It is said that it burns so fast that some black powder grains may be laid on gun cotton, and if the gun cotton is ignited, it will burn out from under the black powder grains without setting them on fire. Nitroglycerin and gun cotton, or nitrocellulose, are only two of a whole series of nitro compounds which have very powerful explosive properties. Another well-known substance of the same general kind is trinitrotoluol, or, as it is commonly called, TNT. It will be remembered that gunpowder is merely a mixture of two fuels and one oxidizing agent, whereas gun cotton and the other nitro-explosives are definite chemical compounds. Such compounds in general explode more violently than simple black powder and are known as high explosives. Moreover, there is a big difference in the manner of explosion of a high explosive as compared with black powder. When black powder is ignited, it burns with very great rapidity, giving off a large volume of gas, and this burning is the only explosion that occurs. On the other hand, many high explosives such as gun cotton, nitroglycerin, and TNT can be burned without causing any explosion at all. A stick of dynamite, for example, can be cut up and thrown into a fire bit by bit with very little danger of exploding, though each piece will burn rather intensely. In the same way, TNT can be burned in large quantities without any explosion occurring. What these high explosives need to cause them to exert their full power is a shock which starts a chemical rearrangement of the molecules into gas instead of solids. This chemical rearrangement is called a detonation. Once a detonation is started in a high explosive, it spreads through the entire mass with a sort of wave action with great rapidity. The speed of detonations varies in different explosives, but in some it is as high as 7,000 yards in a second. A detonating fuse consisting of a long thread of TNT, encased in a lead covering, will thus set off a number of charges of explosive almost instantly if a detonating cap is exploded at one part of the fuse. Ordinarily, the detonation of high explosives is started by exploding a blasting cap in contact with them. These blasting caps contain fulminate of mercury, a substance that explodes with great suddenness and which seems particularly well adapted to producing detonations. Owing to its porous nature, dry gun cotton burns with extreme rapidity, and moreover, it detonates with violence from a moderate shock. However, when it is moistened with 25% of its own weight of water, it becomes safe to handle, for it can be burned only with extreme difficulty, and it can be detonated in this state only by exploding a priming charge of dry gun cotton in contact with the mass of wet cotton. But when it does detonate, it is just as powerful as the dry cotton. For many years, wet gun cotton was used as the explosive charge in submarine mines and torpedoes. As long as the dry gun cotton priming charges were kept out of contact with the wet mass, it was perfectly safe to store or handle. After the discovery of nitro-explosives, an attempt was made to use them for propellants in guns, but they detonated with such instantaneous violence that they would simply blow the gun all to pieces before the bullet had time to move. To make them suitable for use in guns, it was necessary to find some way to prevent them from detonating and to slow down the burning to a reasonable speed. This was finally accomplished in the case of gun cotton, which now forms the basis of most of our smokeless powders. Instead of leaving the nitrocellulose in a light and fluffy form, it is dissolved in some solvent, and then evaporated into a glue-like mass or colloid, which detonates with difficulty or not at all, and which burns with a reasonable speed. One of the earliest successful smokeless powders was made by dissolving gun cotton in nitroglycerin, and adding about 5% of Vaseline, and afterwards extruding the soft mass into long cords. This is the British propellant called cordite, which is composed of 37 parts gun cotton, 58 parts nitroglycerin, and 5 parts Vaseline. Another explosive formed by mixing gun cotton and nitroglycerin is blasting gelatin. This mixture is a very fortunate one chemically because gun cotton has insufficient oxygen in it to turn all its carbon completely to carbon dioxide, and nitroglycerin has too much oxygen. By mixing the two substances in proper proportions, the excessive oxygen in one explosive supplies the deficiency in the other, and the products of the explosion of such a mixture are nitrogen gas, carbon dioxide gas, and water, in the form of steam. Many of our most popular rifle and pistol powders of today are made by dissolving gun cotton in nitroglycerin, and then forming the resultant mass into small grains or flakes. Examples are the well-known rifle powder Hyvel and the pistol powder Bullseye. These powders, made with both nitrocellulose and nitroglycerin, are usually called nitroglycerin powders or double base powders. Another method of making nitrocellulose into smokeless powder is to dissolve it in a mixture of ether and alcohol, thus forming a sticky mass having very much the same consistency as melted glue. This mass, called colloid, meaning glue-like, is then extruded into little tubes like fine macaroni, and these tubes are cut into short lengths, after which the ether and alcohol are evaporated off, leaving a hard substance something like dried glue. This dried-out colloid of gun cotton is what most modern smokeless powders are made of. A powder made in this way is called a nitrocellulose powder or a single-base powder. Examples are the government pyro powder, used in the '06 Springfield rifle cartridges, the DuPont IMR or improved military rifle powders, such as the DuPont IMR 1147 and IMR 1185 powders used in the latest M1.30 caliber cartridges, DuPont pistol powder No. 5, and many others. Such smokeless powders are made in the form of flat flakes or small cylindrical grains with a hole running through the center. In other words, they are like little sections cut off of a fine tube of macaroni. The object of having the hole through the center of the powder is to control the rate of burning so as to hold the pressure of the powder up as long as possible. The great trouble with getting high velocity in a gun is the fact that when the powder in the cartridge is ignited, it turns into gas, and this gas confined into the small space of the cartridge case creates a very high pressure which pushes the bullet along the bore of the gun. But as soon as the bullet starts to move along the bore of the gun, that leaves more space for the gas to occupy. Hence there is less pressure, and the effect of the powder would rapidly fall off to nothing unless special means were taken to keep it up. One of these special means is the perforation of the powder grain, which causes it to have a larger burning surface as the combustion proceeds. This is because the powder flash ignites the inside of the tube as well as the outside. As the grain burns, the outside surface gets smaller, hence the rate of evolution of gas would tend to decrease. However, this is balanced off by the fact that as the inside of the grain burns, the inside surface gets bigger. Therefore, there is a larger surface on the inside for the evolution of gas as the combustion proceeds. The balance between these two surfaces can be controlled by the ratio of the inside diameter to the outside diameter in the finished grain of powder. In cannon powders, there are usually several perforations instead of one. Another method of controlling the burning of the powder and making it more progressive, that is, making it hold up its pressure longer during the travel of the bullet, is by coating powder with a substance which makes it burn slowly at first. As this coating burns off the outside of the powder, the speed of combustion increases. These progressive burning powders tend to give a more uniformly distributed pressure, which is sustained longer during the travel of the bullet. Moreover, the maximum pressure is not so high, because instead of being exerted all at once, the pressure is spread out more evenly during the entire travel of the bullet. The latest DuPont improved military rifle powder such as IMR No. 17, IMR No. 1147 and IMR No. 1185 are progressive powders. Like black powder, smokeless powders are controlled as to their speed of burning by the grain size also. Powders with very fine grains burn up in a hurry, and therefore are suited for short barrel weapons. Powders with very large grains take longer to burn up, therefore are suited to long barrel weapons. For any given size of gun, such as the caliber .30 rifle, there is a granulation powder that is suitable, and a larger or smaller size will either give too high pressures or will not burn up completely before leaving the barrel. However, in the Springfield rifle, the grains may be either long and slender or short and fat and still be about the same size. In general, better results are obtained if the grains are long and slender because this leaves bigger air spaces between the grain for the priming flame to penetrate, and thus better ignition is obtained. For example, the number 1147 powder has tubular grains that are cut 22 to the inch, and the number 1145 has tubular grains cut 11 to the inch. In other words, they are twice as long. Now, these longer grains do not load as uniformly in a loading machine because they do not pack as well as the shorter grains. Some people, knowing that you can get charges which weigh more nearly the same with the fine grain powder, insisted that it should be used for ammunition where great accuracy is desired. Tests, however, proved that the longer grains, even with charges which varied in weight, give better accuracy than shorter grains because in the shorter grains the ignition was irregular owing to the space between the grains being filled up so as to make it difficult for the primer flame to penetrate. The rate of burning of the powders above described such as DuPont and the Hercules High-Vel depends not only on the grain size, but also on the resistance that the bullet offers to being moved. If any of these powders are ignited in the open air, they will burn slowly, the same as a pile of grains of celluloid, and there would be no explosion. On the other hand, when they are ignited in a gun, the first grains burn and give off hot gases, and these hot gases in turn accelerate the burning of the other grains. The more the gases are confined, the hotter they are, and the faster the combustion of the remaining powder will be. Thus, with a heavy bullet or with the cartridge case full of powder, the combustion is more rapid than it is with a light bullet or with a cartridge case only partly filled with powder. There are some powders which must burn with a big airspace in the case and a light bullet. These are powders used for reduced loads. There are also powders which must burn with no resistance at all in the form of a bullet to hold back the gases. This is the case with powder used in blank cartridges where there is no bullet, but only a paper wad. This powder must burn with extreme rapidity under low pressure. The powder most used for this purpose is called EC, blank fire powder. We have seen that gun cotton burns with extreme rapidity. If we mix it with nitroglycerin, it burns more slowly. If we should compress it or mix it up with glue or do anything to take away its fluffy consistency, it would tend to make it burn more slowly. Folioing these principles, blank powder can be made by taking nitrocellulose or some other nitro compound such as nitrolignin, nitrate wood, in combination with other suitable substances, and dampening the fluffy material with gum water, then rolling it into little balls or grains. Thus it is almost gun cotton. The violence of its burning is reduced by the fact that it is glued together by the gum water solution. Blank cartridge powder cannot be used with a bullet or charge of shot in the cartridge. The added resistance is liable to cause it to detonate and burst the gun. A blank cartridge powder very commonly used in this country is called EC, from the originators, the Explosives Company, and there is also a shotgun powder by this same name. I once had an acquaintance who got held of some of this EC, blank cartridge powder, and being acquainted with EC, shotgun powder, he decided that it was the same thing and loaded up some shot shells with it. The first one he fired lifted the side neatly out of one barrel of his L.C. Smith hammerless shotgun, but fortunately did not inflict any personal injury. Powder for reduced loads is midway between blank fire powder and the regular rifle powder. It has to be fast burning because it cannot depend much on the resistance of the bullet, as it is used in small charges in big cartridge cases with lots of airspace, and it is also used with very light bullets. It is difficult to make a powder that will perform well under these circumstances, but this has finally been accomplished, and an extremely satisfactory powder of this kind is sporting rifle powder No. 80, which was used with the gallery practice outfits issued to the Army some years ago. Shotgun powders differ considerably from rifle powders. The shotgun is distinguished from the rifle not only in not having a rifled bore, but also in being usually of considerably greater caliber. To produce a weapon easy to handle, it was necessary to make the forward portion of the barrel very light. Therefore, there must be but little pressure except near the breech. Distribution of the shot in a uniform pattern seems to require that comparatively little pressure be exerted on the shot in the forward portion of the barrel. For these reasons, shotgun powders must burn more rapidly than rifle powders and, therefore, there must be more surface exposed. Shotgun powders are of two kinds, dense and bulk powders. Perhaps the best-known dense powder is ballistite. This is a nitroglycerin powder composed of gun cotton completely dissolved in nitroglycerin, so as to form a homogeneous gelatin or colloid. It is then formed into small grains or very thin flakes. The advantage of this powder is that it leaves very little solid residue when burned, and is consequently free from smoke, and also leaves very little residue in the bore. It is little affected by moisture. Bulk powders are a great deal lighter and more bulky than the dense. In fact, the term bulk means that the powder can be loaded bulk for bulk with black powder. In other words, you can load this powder by measure and can use the same measure for loading it as you would for loading black powder. The first successful bulk powder was known as Schultz after the inventor Captain E. Schultz of the Prussian artillery. This powder was made from nitrolignin or nitrate wood, mixed with the nitrates of barium and potassium. Most of the modern bulk shotgun powders do not use nitrolignin but use nitrocellulose instead. One of the best known is DuPont's smokeless shotgun powder, which is a straight nitrocellulose composition throughout. The great difference between black powder and smokeless powder is that in the black powder more than half the products of combustion, about 55.71%, are solids. These solids are principally potassium carbonate, potassium substrate, and potassium sulfate, and when they are ejected from the gun along with the powder gases, they form a dense white smoke. A large amount of solid material is also deposited on the inside of the gun barrel, so that with black powder a heavy fouling accumulates which necessitates cleaning after each 10 or more shots. With smokeless powder, on the other hand, the products of combustion are almost entirely gases and water vapor, so that there is little or no smoke and little or no deposit in the gun barrel. Besides the good old-fashioned black powder and the smokeless powders above mentioned, there is a type known as semi-smokeless, which is a mixture of black powder and gun cotton. The Lesmock powder, so much used in caliber .22 cartridges, is of this type and consists of 85% black powder and 15% gun cotton. The semi-smokeless powders are extremely accurate in .22 caliber loads, and while they have more smoke and fouling than the smokeless powders, the fouling is of such a nature that it does not cake or harden in the barrel, and firing does not have to be interrupted for cleaning the barrel. A disadvantage of Lesmock powder, which, however, does not affect the user but only the maker, is that it is extremely dangerous to manufacture. Pistol and revolver powders. A number of years ago, all pistol cartridges were loaded with black powder. But it is dirty and very quickly fouls the barrel, so that after 8 or 10 shots the gun loses its accuracy unless the barrel is cleaned. Moreover, it gives an objectionable smoke and an extra heavy recoil. The reason for this very heavy recoil with black powder has been explained in another chapter, which treats of interior ballistics. As mentioned above, black powders are designated by the grain size as FG, FFG, FFFG, etc. The more Fs, the finer the grain. Very small cartridges use the finer powder, larger ones the coarser. The black powder cartridges are practically obsolete now, and should be entirely so. The only way in which the black powder has any advantage over the smokeless is in safety. It is not as much subject to erratic pressures from small variations in loading. The only excuse that I can see for wanting to use factory-loaded black powder cartridges at the present time is that the Remington Arms Company manufactures a black powder .45 Colt cartridge which has more velocity than most smokeless powder cartridges now on the market, and many shooters who want to get the maximum power will naturally use this cartridge with its 40-grain load. However, they will pay for the additional power in a greatly increased punishment from recoil. Many years ago this was the standard load, but it was reduced in order to reduce the recoil, so that for a long time from 30 to 35 grains was the usual charge. Lately, with a number of experimenters trying to get higher velocities, the cartridge company decided to load a cartridge that would give the maximum safe velocity for those who needed an extremely powerful load. They also load the .38 Special and several other cartridges with very heavy loads of black powder, thus safely obtaining velocities higher than the standard for smokeless loads. Up until a few years ago, most .22 caliber cartridges for target practice, or for use in fine arms, were loaded with Lesmock powder because smokeless could not be used without having the arms ruined from corrosion, even with the greatest care in cleaning. This was because the primers then in use were very corrosive, and the only thing that would save the barrel was a large charge of powder to dilute the products of the primer combustion and wash them out of the barrel. The smokeless charge of the .22 short was too small to do this, and excessive corrosion resulted. Even with the largest smokeless cartridges, great care and very prompt and thorough cleaning was all that would save the barrel. Now, however, non-corrosive primers are almost universally used with smokeless pistol cartridges, and the smokeless .22 can be used with no danger at all of having the barrel corroded. Smokeless powders for use in pistols or revolvers must be very much quicker in their time of burning than rifle powders, so that the powder can all burn up before the bullet has left the very short barrel used. Because the barrel is so short, the progressive powders now so popular for rifle use cannot be used in pistols. Pistol powders are made in the form of very fine thin flakes that burn practically all at once. For many years, one of the most popular powders for loading pistol cartridges has been Bullseye, which is a nitroglycerin or double base powder made by the Hercules Powder Company. The term double base comes from the fact that there are two principal ingredients, or bases, used in making the powder: nitrocellulose, or gun cotton, and nitroglycerin, which is mixed with or dissolved in the nitrocellulose. This bullseye powder has been used almost exclusively by some factories over long periods of years for loading most of their pistol cartridges. It is also one of the several powders that are standard for loading the .45 automatic pistol cartridge by the Ordnance Department. Pistol cartridges that are not generally loaded with it are the 3 rifle cartridges that also may be used in revolvers, namely the .32-20, the .38-40, and the .44-40, which are most often loaded with sharpshooter smokeless powder as a compromise for either rifle or pistol use. This is also a double base powder made by the Hercules Powder Company. An extremely popular single base, or straight nitrocellulose powder designed especially for use in pistols and revolvers is DuPont Pistol Powder No. 5. It is also standard for the government .45 pistol cartridge. Many of the older pistol cartridges designed for black powder have a case too large for the best results with extremely dense powders like Bullseye and DuPont No. 5. For these cartridges, stick as the .38-40 and .44-40. DuPont Sporting Rifle Powder No. 80 is excellent. This is the type of powder known as bulk powder described above, but it cannot, like the original bulk powders, be measured bulk for bulk with black powder, and the same loads used. Identification of black and smokeless powders. The appearance of black powder is quite characteristic, and once it is seen and carefully examined, it will always be easy to tell it from smokeless powder at a glance. Black powder is composed of irregular grains of a fairly uniform size, with a glossy black surface. There are various sizes or granulations of black powder used, but in any one cartridge the grain sizes will be fairly uniform, for the larger and smaller sizes are removed by screening, as was described earlier in this chapter. Some varieties of smokeless powder also have a glossy black surface, but they look very different from black powder, in spite of the similarity of color. The smokeless grains have a perfectly defined shape, such as small squares, discs, or cylinders, with or without a hole in the center, while the grains of black powder are of the irregular shape caused by forming the damp mass into a cake, and then, when this cake has hardened, breaking it and crushing it into grains of the desired size, polishing the grains by rumbling them in a barrel, and then removing the large grains as well as the dust and very small grains by differential screening. No smokeless powder is naturally black. The reason why some of it in the finished state has a black surface is because it is coated with graphite. This graphite coating is put on because the powder is a hard amber-like substance which is a non-conductor of electricity and is very strongly susceptible to becoming electrified by friction, especially the friction of one grain on another in handling, loading, etc., so that in cold, dry weather the grains have a tendency to stick together and become difficult to load in even charges. Moreover, the occurrence of sparks of static electricity is a very serious fire hazard, especially when the air may contain highly inflammable volatile vapors of the solvent used in making the powder. Coating the surface with graphite makes it a conductor of electricity and prevents trouble from this cause. Dense, smokeless powders are composed principally of a hard, translucent, horny colloid very much like celluloid, made by dissolving nitrocellulose in a mixture of ether and alcohol, and then drying it out, as has already been described. It should be understood that there are several grades of nitrocellulose depending on the degree of nitration. The very high nitrogen product, or gun cotton, will not dissolve in ether and alcohol. The lower nitration nitrocellulose will dissolve completely and is used to make the powder known as pyro. A compound of high nitration cotton mixed into the pyro colloid forms the modern rifle powders known as the IMR, or improved military rifle series. Low nitration nitrocellulose, colloid and then dried out, is also used to make celluloid, which is very much the same as some smokeless powders. In fact, finely chopped celluloid can be loaded into a cartridge and used to propel a bullet. These dense powders are made in a variety of different sizes, from sticks perhaps 4 feet long to grains as small as ordinary sand. The rate of burning and the maximum pressure can be regulated by the grain size. The large sizes naturally burn more slowly than the small ones. Thus, the cannon powders have very large-sized grains, the rifle powders have smaller ones, and the pistol powders the smallest of all. Cannon powders are usually of the natural color of the colloid, that is, a dark amber, and very frequently are seen in the shape of cylinders with 7 holes running through from end to end. These tubular perforations control the rate of burning by allowing the ignition to take place inside as well as outside. As the outside surface burns, it gets smaller and thus slows the rate of burning. but this effect is balanced by the fact that the inside surface gets larger as it burns. Rifle powders are most usually in the form of small cylinders, with a single perforation through the center, and with the surface graphite, so that the color is a shiny black. Small flat squares are often seen. Dense pistol powders are usually of a greenish-brown color, and on close examination are seen to consist of small flat chips. Bulk powders for both rifle, pistol, and shotgun are mealy in appearance, like fine sawdust, and the color may be grayish-white, light yellow, cream color, gray, or pink. Other colors are sometimes seen and are due to certain dyes or coloring substances used by some makers. Less smoke or semi-smokeless powders look like fine gray sand. It is a comparatively easy matter for the student of powders to gather together a collection of the more common types and brands. Purchase a few dozen of the larger-sized, empty pill files and suitable labels to paste on the side of them. Collect all the different rifle cartridges, shot shells, etc., and break them down for examination. As a new powder is discovered, ascertain correctly its name, maker, and characteristics, and place it in one of the files, properly labeled. One soon learns to identify the various types of powder by sight, coupled with the knowledge of just what cartridge they came from. However, some of the modern, dense rifle powders cannot be identified accurately by sight alone, as many brands are of similar composition, type, and grain size. Only a trained laboratory worker can determine the identity of such powders. It is often an aid in the diagnosis of the different kinds of powder to light a small pinch of it on some fireproof surface. Black powder will burn with a quick flash of white flame, usually with a purplish tinge, and will give a large puff of light gray smoke, and it will leave a heavy gray residue on the surface. As the powder flashes, a number of the grains will be projected through the air in the form of burning sparks. Frequently, in accidents involving black powder, these little particles of partly burned powder are driven into the skin of the victim, where they will leave a permanent tattooing of dark blue specks, unless each grain is carefully picked out. When a small pinch of smokeless powder is ignited in the manner described above, it burns with a brisk yellow flame and gives off no smoke. The residue left sticking to the cold surface consists of an irregular network of partly burned powder which has adhered to the metal and has failed to burn entirely on AC count of the contact with the cool support. It is usually translucent and somewhat yellowish in color, with some charred material or graphite giving it a blackened appearance. The residue of black powder can be washed off readily, while that left by the smokeless is insoluble, except that in some bulk powders certain mineral salts, such as potassium nitrate, are incorporated, and the remains of these salts, when present, will dissolve. The flame of smokeless powder resembles that of celluloid, which is practically the same in composition as some smokeless powders. Like celluloid, smokeless powder burns with a hot, flaring yellow flame, and in small quantities in the open air, it burns at about the same speed. A large grain of cannon powder can be lighted with a match and then blown out. While this experiment is decidedly not recommended, the author has, as a demonstration, taken a grain of cannon powder in his hand, ignited it with a match, used it to light a cigarette with, and then blown out the half-burned grain. But you cannot do this with black powder, or even with all kinds of smokeless powder. The author once saw a young man trying to light with a match a large grain of spherohexagonal black powder about an inch in diameter which was lying on an ashtray. An attempt was made to stop him, but before this could be accomplished, the grain ignited, with a sudden blinding puff of flame about 3 feet in diameter, which cost the foolhardy young experimenter his eyebrows and taught him very sharply the difference between black and smokeless powder, but fortunately did no real harm. Smokeless powder, particularly of the single-base nitrocellulose variety, is not sensitive to shock or friction, and is not dangerously easy to ignite, and moreover, when ignited in an unconfined condition, it merely burns with extreme rapidity and great heat, and does not explode. For these reasons, it is much safer than black powder to store or handle. One disadvantage that it has is the fact that in some varieties, chemical changes are apt to occur with age, and the powder then deteriorates. Fortunately, this deterioration always weakens the powder, so that there is no reason to be afraid to shoot old cartridges because the pressure might be high, for the powder always becomes weaker when deterioration sets in. Occasionally, decomposing smokeless powder may give off brown fumes of nitrous oxide, which are highly poisonous and corrosive. And very often, The decomposition of smokeless powder may generate heat and thus start a fire by spontaneous combustion. This can occur equally well with celluloid when articles made of this substance are stored in bulk, for celluloid in some of its forms acts much like smokeless powder. On two separate occasions, the author has observed instances where celluloid protractors or triangles stacked on the shelves of a warehouse have deteriorated almost to the point of combustion. And on another occasion, he investigated a fire which proved to have originated from this cause. Again, he saw a safe in which the user had placed a large stack of celluloid protractors. When the safe was opened some months later, there emerged brown fumes, and some revolvers and other metal objects in the safe were badly corroded. The author was applied to for an explanation of the cause, and an investigation showed that the celluloid protractors, stacked together in one corner of the safe, had turned to various mottled shades of opaque yellow, and were very badly warped and cracked. Another object lesson on the decomposition of materials of this nature was the terrible accident a few years ago in a hospital in Cleveland, where spontaneous combustion occurred in a small room where X-ray film, celluloid, were stored near steam pipes. The resulting nitrous fumes killed over 100 patients in a few minutes. The author happened to be in Baltimore in 1928 when a magazine containing 175,000 pounds of smokeless powder at the Curtis Bay Ordnance Depot nearby was destroyed by spontaneous combustion. Two colored men and a team of mules were standing by the adjoining magazine, 400 feet away, when they heard a hissing sound, suddenly increasing to a noise like the safety valve on a locomotive, and looking around, they saw flames begin to spurt out of the doomed building. They started to run, but the terrific heat overtook them and blistered the backs of their necks so that they fell to the ground. Fortunately, they fell into a slight depression, so that the worst of the heat then passed over them, and they were not seriously hurt. The mules simply trotted around the corner of the building, so that they were in a shadow which cut off the intense heat. The two men had placed their lunch in paper bags on the ground, and had hung their coats on a couple of spades leaning against the side of the building where they were standing, which, as mentioned above, was 400 feet from the fire. The lunch bags and the coats were burned up, and the shovel handles were charred. An aviator, flying across the nearby town at an altitude of 2,000 feet, saw a yellow tower of flame rise to a height that he estimated as 2,000 feet higher than he was flying, then slowly die down. The metal siding and roof sheets of the magazine whirled high in the yellow flame, like leaves in an autumn wind. A fountain of powder can skyrocketed around. All this lasted a few brief but exciting seconds, and everything was over. There was no explosion, no noise except a loud roaring sound, like escaping steam. There were no casualties. People in the nearby city did not know that there had been a fire until they read it in the papers. That is a typical smokeless powder fire, or flare. There is no explosion. Simply a fire of extremely short duration, and accompanied by almost unbelievably intense heat. But if that had been black powder, it would have gone off with a bang, and would have leveled every building within hundreds of feet in every direction. For that reason, black powder is always stored in very small lots, in small huts, well separated, and no such explosion with black powder can happen, simply because it is so dangerous that no large quantity of it is ever collected together at one time. Great care is exercised in the protection of the public in such matters, and neither high explosives or black powder are ever stored in dangerous quantities in the vicinity of a city. It may surprise some of our readers to note that we infer above that black powder is more dangerous than smokeless. But contrary to the general impression, black powder is one of the most dangerous explosives to manufacture, store, or handle. It will explode from the slightest spark, and very often a slight friction, or some apparently insignificant cause may produce enough of a spark to cause an explosion. Black powder will ignite at a temperature of 572 degrees Fahrenheit. And when it does ignite in any great quantity, it explodes with great violence, whether it is confined or not, instead of merely burning, as is the case with smokeless powder. It is, nevertheless, true that black powder is much safer for the experimenter to use in reloading than is smokeless, and that burst or damaged firearms more often result from the use of smokeless than of black. This is because the smokeless powders are potentially much stronger than the black powder. If a strong vessel should be filled entirely full of black powder, and the powder should then be ignited, the maximum pressure that would result, even if the vessel were strong enough to confine all the gas into the original space occupied by the powder charge, is about 86,000 pounds per square inch. This has been tried experimentally, Gun cotton, nitroglycerin, and other high explosives, as well as smokeless powder, are all too strong for such an experiment, but calculations indicate that they would, under such conditions, give pressures in general a little over 4 times as great as those given by black powder, or say around 360,000 pounds per square inch, and fulminate of mercury, which is even stronger, would give nearly 5 times as much pressure as black powder, about 412,000 pounds per square inch. This explains very clearly why smokeless powder is potentially more dangerous in guns than is black powder, and a very practical reason why greater care must be used in loading smokeless than in loading black powder is the fact that a small change in the original pressure, such as would be caused by reducing the airspace in a cartridge, may, in the case of smokeless powder, change the whole character of the burning of the powder to something like a detonation. On the other hand, nothing like this can occur with black powder, which burns in just the same way whether it is compressed or loose, or even if a double charge is used or 2 bullets are put in the gun. It is well for the legal authorities to realize that ordinary smokeless rifle powder, such as is used by rifle club members and others for reloading cartridges, is not the type of explosive that can be used to blow things up. A misapprehension on this score has caused much unnecessary commotion among the police and others at times. For example, shortly after the liner Morro Castle caught fire and burned at sea, there was much talk of sabotage, plot, etc., and a few days later the papers reported a case of a man who had been detected taking a small package of rifle powder on board a ship, no doubt to send it to some friend who wanted to reload cartridges. A great hue and cry was raised for a few days, and the public was led to believe that a serious plot had been discovered just in time. But the facts are that smokeless powder of this type will not produce an explosion unless it is strongly confined. It would be practically impossible to use this powder in any way so as to damage the ship structurally, though of course if the powder had been ignited in the can it would make a small, weak explosion of sorts. The only real danger would be that the material is highly inflammable, the same as celluloid is, and carrying a 1-pound can of smokeless rifle powder on a ship is just about as dangerous as carrying a package containing a few dozen celluloid hair combs. Carrying this powder on a ship would not be half as dangerous as taking aboard a quart of gasoline. Of course, when powder of this kind burns in very large quantities, terrific heat is generated, accompanied by the evolution of tremendous quantities of gas, and if many hundred of pounds of powder were burned on board a ship, the hull might be pushed open, decks blown up in the air, etc., by the evolution of such great quantities of gas in a short time. In this connection, it is interesting to recall what happened on the battleship Liberté. Both this battleship and the Jena of the French Navy were destroyed some years ago by the spontaneous combustion of smokeless powder. At that time, smokeless powder was relatively new, and the particular type used by France turned out to be quite susceptible to spontaneous combustion due to deterioration. The author was more than usually interested in reading the details of the destruction of the Liberté, because he had been a visitor on that ship a short time before, and had been very pleasantly entertained by the wardroom officers, many of whom were killed in this disaster. The ship carried approximately 275,000 pounds of smokeless powder, besides the usual high explosive shells, gun cotton for torpedoes, and the various other such materials that a battleship has on board. At 5:50 in the afternoon of the day of the disaster, the magazines were observed to be on fire, and yellow flames from the burning of smokeless powder spurted from the magazines and ammunition hoists. Several small explosions occurred at this time, but it was fully 20 minutes later, at 10 minutes past 6, when the very great elevation of temperature and pressure finally resulted in the terrific explosion which destroyed the ship. Most likely this final explosion was due to the detonation of a magazine full of high explosive shells, rather than the action of the smokeless powder alone. This incident illustrates very clearly the difference between the action of smokeless powder and that of black powder, for if these magazines had been filled with black powder, the whole ship would have been blown to pieces at the first spark. The black powder would have gone off all at one instant instead of burning for 20 minutes before the final explosion occurred. Primers, detonators, and initiators. There is still another class of explosives besides the propellants and high explosives previously described. This other class M braces the substances used to ignite the gunpowder in the cartridge, called primers, and those used to cause high explosives to detonate, called detonators. Together, these explosives are called initiators. Any priming compound requires, as one of its principal ingredients, some substance that is sensitive to friction or percussion. In other words, something that will explode when it is mashed by the blow of the firing pin. Chloride of potash, when powdered and mixed with a fuel, such as, for example, antimony sulfide, acts in this way. Another substance that is extremely sensitive to percussion is fulminate of mercury, which is made by dissolving mercury in nitric acid and then pouring the mixture into alcohol, and afterward collecting the crystals which precipitate out. An old standard priming compound consists of fulminate of mercury, chloride of potash, and antimony sulfide. Fulminate of mercury is one of the most sudden and brusque of explosives, and has the quality of causing the detonation of relatively insensitive explosives, such as TNT, when it is exploded in contact with them. For this reason, it is a favorite detonator. Another one is lead azide, which is similar in its qualities to fulminate, but has the added dangerous quality of exploding just as well when wet as when dry. Dynamite, TNT, and most other high explosives do not explode when ignited. In small quantities, they will burn quietly, and in some cases with relative difficulty. They are always used by detonating them by means of a dynamite cap, or by a detonator of fulminate or of lead azide, or of some other such compound. A dynamite cap, or blasting cap, is nothing more than a copper capsule filled with fulminate. In other words, a detonator. These caps are extremely dangerous, for they will explode from any moderate abuse, and when they do explode, they go off with extreme violence. A common item in the daily papers is, "Boy pounds blasting cap, loses fingers." Blasting caps are made of copper, cylindrical in shape, somewhat smaller in diameter than a lead pencil, and from 1 inch to 2 inches more or less in length. If you find any such object as this, act with extreme caution. Unless you know exactly what it is, do not handle it any more than absolutely necessary to put it where it can do no harm, as at the bottom of a deep river. Even the man who knows the danger is not immune. On May 1, 1934, Captain Clarence O'Leary, Ordnance Department, USA, an expert on explosives and the author of the safety manual for handling them, was investigating the theft of some small arms ammunition and alone at the time was searching in a magazine area on a large army post. Chancing upon a culvert, he noticed a piece of metal protruding from the earth. Explosion followed, with a noise like that of a pistol shot. Fortunately, the capsule was empty at the time, except for a slight residue which adhered to the bottom when the remainder was dissolved out. But even this small amount was sufficient to cause a startling report, though the capsule was not ruptured, and the only damage was an insignificant burn on the fingers. A vital point, and one which cannot be emphasized too greatly in regard to blasting caps and detonators, is that they are intended solely to be used to set off a much larger explosion of some substance which detonates. The caps themselves are very much more sensitive than these explosives that they are intended to detonate. Therefore, it is one of the universal rules of safety in handling and storing explosives, never to keep the detonators or blasting caps near the high explosives, until the moment they are put together to produce the explosion. They should not be stored in the same room, nor should they be handled or transported together. The particular lesson in this statement is intended for those members of the police who may not have had an opportunity to learn about the safety precautions required with such materials, but who very naturally might, in connection with an arrest of bomb makers or seizure of an illegal stock of explosives, very innocently carry all the components involved, together in one conveyance to one place of storage. At least 2 such cases of mixing loose caps and high explosives have come to the personal attention of the author. The Briscoe case, the incident that will now be described, is very instructive, not only as showing the extreme danger of the blasting cap, but also to illustrate some of the unusual accidents that the firearms or explosives expert will be called on to investigate. The story occupied a considerable amount of space in the newspapers for several days, and extracts from these papers will prove interesting. Baltimore Evening Sunday, December 31, 1934. Woman killed in Landvale, St. Mystery. Miss Catherine Briscoe, 51-year-old sister of City Councilman Philander C. Briscoe, today was fatally injured in the cellar of her home at 209 West Landvale Street, apparently struck in the chest by a bullet. She died a few minutes later. Members of her family said she had gone to the cellar to put some coal on the furnace fire. A few moments later, she staggered up the cellar stairs, called her brother. Clutching a wound in her chest, she gasped that she had been hurt. Her brother telephoned for a physician, who upon arrival found Miss Briscoe dead. Neither the coroner nor the physician were able to determine the exact nature of her injury. Washington Times, January 1, 1935. Police today advanced the theory that the woman may have been the victim of an unusual explosion of a bullet in the furnace. A careful search of the cellar failed to reveal any kind of weapon from which the piece of lead could have been fired. Washington Herald, January 1, 1935. At first it was thought that Miss Briscoe had been slain by an exploding bullet which had found its way into the furnace. The fire in the furnace was extinguished, and for 5 hours detectives and policemen screened every bit of ash to find the empty shell of the supposed bullet. No empty shell was found. Baltimore Sunday, January 2, 1935. A coal miner's detonating cap probably killed Miss Catherine Briscoe, according to Dr. Robert W. Wood, ballistics and scientific expert, who became identified unofficially yesterday with the case that has been baffling the Baltimore police since Wednesday. The doctor branded as absurd the theory of Captain Nicholas B. Gatch of the Northwestern District that Miss Briscoe had been the victim of a coal gas explosion that propelled a bit of waste metal into her body.